Everyone laughed. When Florida wildlife officials announced they would be releasing snakes into the Everglades to deal with the python problem, the reaction was exactly what you would expect from the internet. Memes, jokes, headlines written with barely concealed disbelief. Comments asking whether the people in charge had lost their minds. The logic seemed absurd on its face. The Everglades already had a snake problem, and the solution was more snakes? The mockery was loud, confident, and almost unanimous. But the people laughing had missed something. Something that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. Something that the scientists who designed this plan had been watching with growing alarm, in silence, while the rest of the world looked away. The Everglades was already collapsing. Not slowly dying in the way that environmental stories usually get told, with projections and timelines and future tense warnings, collapsing now, quietly, completely. And the snake release was not a sign that the people in charge had run out of ideas. It was a sign that they finally understood what the problem actually was. This was not a crazy plan, it was something else entirely. Picture the Everglades as it existed before any of this began. Not the diminished version that exists today, but the full thing, a river of grass 60 miles wide and 100 miles long, moving slowly south from Lake Okeechobee to Florida Bay, one of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the Western Hemisphere, home to hundreds of species of birds, dozens of species of mammals, alligators, panthers, wood storks, snail kites, white-tailed deer, bobcats, river otters, marsh rabbits, raccoons. A system so complex and so interconnected that removing any single piece of it sends reverberations through everything else. The way pulling a thread from a piece of fabric doesn't just create a hole, it changes the tension of the entire weave. This system had survived for thousands of years. It had survived drought and flood and fire and the slow geological changes of a peninsula sitting at the edge of the tropics. It was not fragile in the way that word is usually used. It was resilient, deeply, structurally resilient, the product of millions of years of ecological negotiation between species that had learned, through the pressure of survival, how to exist together. And then, quietly, it began to empty. Not all at once, not with a single event that could be pointed to and named and responded to. It emptied the way a room empties when people leave one at a time, gradually, in a way that is easy to miss until you look around and realize that almost everyone is gone. The birds were fewer, then fewer still. The mammals that had been common became uncommon, then rare, then absent. The sounds changed. Anyone who had spent time in the Everglades across decades noticed it. A stillness that was not natural stillness, not the quiet of a healthy ecosystem at rest, but something closer to absence. The system wasn't breaking. It was emptying. The cause was not a mystery. It had a name. It had a face. And by the time the full scale of what it had done became clear, it was already too late to stop it through conventional means. The Burmese python is native to Southeast Asia. It is one of the largest snakes on Earth, capable of reaching lengths of over 20 feet and weights exceeding 200 pounds. It is a generalist predator, meaning it will eat almost anything it can overpower and swallow. It is also almost perfectly suited to the subtropical environment of South Florida. The climate matches its native range. The prey base is enormous. The landscape, dense sawgrass, shallow water, and tangled vegetation, provides ideal cover for an ambush predator that hunts by stealth and constriction. How they arrived is a story that has been told many times in many ways. And the short version is this: the exotic pet trade. Burmese pythons were imported into the United States in large numbers through the 1980s and the 1990s. They were sold as pets. Some were released deliberately by owners who could no longer manage an animal that grew to 15 feet and ate rabbits. Some escaped during Hurricane Andrew in 1992, when a breeding facility near the Everglades was destroyed. Some were simply let go. It does not matter now exactly how many founding individuals there were, or precisely when the population crossed the threshold from isolated individuals to an established breeding colony. What matters is what happened next. They reproduced explosively. A female Burmese python can lay between 50 and 100 eggs in a single clutch. In their native range, they are kept in check by predators, parasites, competitors, and a prey base that evolved alongside them over millions of years. In the Everglades, none of those checks existed. They entered an ecosystem that had no experience with them, no behavioral adaptations to avoid them, no predators capable of reliably killing adults, and an almost unlimited supply of prey. The result was not a population. It was an explosion. The numbers that came back from scientific surveys were difficult to process. In areas of the Everglades where pythons had established themselves most completely, populations of raccoons had declined by 99%. Opossums declined by 98%. White-tailed deer declined by 94%. Marsh rabbits and foxes had effectively disappeared from large sections of the park. These were not species that had declined gradually over decades of habitat loss and human pressure. They had been functionally removed from entire ecosystems within a period of years. The predator had arrived, the prey had no answer, and the collapse was faster and more complete than almost anyone had predicted. Walk through the affected sections of the Everglades today, and the silence is the first thing you notice. Not peaceful silence, wrong silence. The kind that tells you something is missing that should be there. The rustle of small mammals in the grass, the alarm calls of birds responding to ground-level movement, the ambient noise of a functioning ecosystem. Instead, there is stillness. And somewhere beneath the water and the vegetation, moving slowly, almost impossible to detect, the pythons are still there. Florida did not do nothing. The response was substantial and creative. Python removal programs were established, trained hunters were employed, detection dogs were trained to find snakes by scent. Radio telemetry was used to track pythons to their breeding aggregations. The Python Challenge, an annual event that mobilized thousands of volunteer hunters, generated enormous public interest and media coverage. Researchers experimented with using male snakes fitted with tracking devices to lead hunters to females. Thermal imaging technology was tested. Trapping programs were evaluated. And the pythons kept coming. Not because the removal efforts were incompetent. The people doing this work were skilled, dedicated, and genuinely effective at finding and removing individual animals. But the math was against them from the beginning. When a single female can produce 50 to 100 offspring per year, and when the population runs into the tens of thousands spread across 1.5 million acres of difficult terrain, removal at the individual level is a maintenance activity, not a solution. You could remove 1,000 pythons and the population would absorb that loss without meaningful disruption. No matter how many they removed, it was not enough. The scoreboard was always moving in the wrong direction. And then scientists found something that made the situation feel even more serious. The lungworm. Reintroducing orientalis, a parasitic worm carried by Burmese pythons, infects the respiratory system of its host. In Southeast Asia, this parasite exists in a balance with its native host population. In Florida, it began spreading, not just to other snake species that came into contact with pythons, to native snakes across a broader area. Studies documented the parasite in species that had never had direct contact with a Burmese python, spreading through the prey animals that both species shared, moving through the food web in ways that were difficult to track and impossible to control through python removal alone. Even where the pythons were not, the damage was already spreading. The invasion had acquired a second front that was invisible, biological, and moving independently of the snakes themselves. If you find breakdowns like this valuable, take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you do not miss what is coming next. And drop a comment. I read everything. This is the moment where the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission made the decision that the internet decided was ridiculous. They announced a program to breed and release eastern indigo snakes into the Everglades. The eastern indigo is the longest native snake in North America. It is non-venomous, glossy black, and extraordinarily striking. It is also a species that had been disappearing from Florida for decades, pushed out by habitat loss, road mortality, and the degradation of the longleaf pine and scrub ecosystems it depends on. It had been functionally absent from large portions of its historical range in the Everglades for years. The headlines wrote themselves. Florida already has too many snakes. Florida's solution to too many snakes is more snakes. The jokes and the disbelief and the mockery followed predictably and loudly. But the people laughing were thinking about it the wrong way. They were thinking about snakes. The scientists were thinking about systems. The eastern indigo snake is not being released into the Everglades to kill pythons directly. An adult indigo snake can and does prey on other snakes, including venomous species, and it has a resistance to certain snake venoms that most other animals lack. It will occasionally prey on juvenile pythons, but that is not the primary mechanism. That is not the point. The point is something deeper, and it requires understanding what the eastern indigo snake actually represents in the ecology of the Everglades, not as an individual animal, but as a keystone species in a system that has been losing its keystones one by one. Eastern indigo snakes are obligate users of gopher tortoise burrows. They shelter in them, they overwinter in them. They depend on them for survival in ways that tie their population directly to the health of the tortoise population and, through the tortoise, to the health of the upland scrub and pine ecosystems that border the Everglades. The gopher tortoise is itself a keystone species. Its burrows are used by over 300 other species as shelter. When the indigo snake disappeared, it was not just a snake that was lost. It was a thread in a web that connected the upland ecosystems to the wetland systems, that connected the scrub to the marsh, that connected dozens of species to each other through a chain of dependencies that had taken millions of years to build. The release of eastern indigo snakes is not a python removal program. It is an ecosystem reconstruction program. It is an attempt to reintroduce a native apex predator that competes with invasive species for territory and resources, that signals to other native species that the system is functional, that uses the habitat infrastructure, the tortoise burrows, that restoration programs have been working to rebuild for years. It is an attempt to give the Everglades back something it lost, and in losing, became more vulnerable to everything that followed. Native apex predators do not just kill prey, they organize ecosystems. Their presence changes the behavior of other animals, where they feed, how long they stay in one place, what vegetation gets grazed and what gets left alone. Ecologists call this a trophic cascade. The reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone is the most famous example. A predator returned to an ecosystem, and the rivers literally changed course because of the behavioral changes it triggered in elk populations. The eastern indigo snake is not a wolf, but the principle is the same. Restore the predator, and the system begins to reorganize around its presence. And there are early signs that something is shifting. Wild-born eastern indigo hatchlings have been documented in areas where the species had been absent. That is not a small thing. It means the released animals are not just surviving, they are establishing. They are breeding. The population is beginning to root itself into the ecosystem. At the same time, other signs of ecological pushback are emerging from unexpected directions. Bobcats have been documented killing pythons. Alligators, which coexist uneasily with large pythons in competition for similar prey in similar space, have been observed in confrontations with large snakes. The native predator community, diminished but not destroyed, appears to be adapting slowly, incrementally, in the halting way that ecological recovery always happens, but adapting nonetheless. The system wasn't dead, it was trying to recover. It had been trying to recover the whole time with whatever tools it still had available. What it needed was not for humans to solve the problem directly. What it needed was for humans to restore enough of the system's own structure that it could begin solving the problem itself. This is the thing that got lost in the mockery. The people who designed the Eastern Indigo program were not under the illusion that a few hundred snakes were going to turn the tide against a python population in the tens of thousands. They were not naive about the math. What they understood, what the science supports, is that ecological resilience does not come from removing the threat. It comes from restoring the system's capacity to respond to threats. A healthy, biodiverse ecosystem with intact predator communities, functioning habitat structure, and the full complement of its native species is not invulnerable to invasion, but it is far more resistant than a hollowed out one. The Everglades became as catastrophically vulnerable to the Burmese python as it did, in part because it was already compromised, already missing pieces, already running on a reduced roster of species, already less than it had been. The python found an ecosystem that had been weakened before it arrived. The plan was never to kill all the pythons. You cannot kill all the pythons. The plan was to rebuild enough of what was lost so the ecosystem could push back, to restore the predator structure, to reestablish the habitat connections, to give the Everglades back enough of its own complexity that the complexity itself became a form of resistance. It was never about killing pythons. It was about rebuilding the system that makes pythons manageable. The world laughed because it looked simple. Add snakes, remove snakes, count snakes. That is the frame most people brought to it, because that is the frame the headlines offered. But nothing about this was simple. The Everglades is not simple. Ecological collapse is not simple. The chain of decisions and accidents and failures that allowed a Southeast Asian snake to hollow out one of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the Western Hemisphere is not simple. And the attempt to reverse that process, not by force, not by removal, not by any single intervention, but by slowly, painstakingly reconstructing the conditions under which the system can heal itself, is about as far from simple as conservation science gets. The Eastern indigo snake is not the solution. It is a signal. It is an act of ecological faith. A decision to invest in the long, slow, uncertain work of restoration, rather than the faster, cleaner, more satisfying work of control. It is a decision to treat the Everglades not as a problem to be managed, but as a system to be restored. And systems, when they are restored, do things that management never can. They adapt. They respond. They push back in ways that no model fully predicts and no removal program can replicate. The plan wasn't crazy, it was misunderstood. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a headline and the truth.